Welcome back to Unburden with Bourbon, the podcast that discusses what is recognized as America's native spirit, bourbon. My name is Simon Provan. Thank you so much for joining me once again as we head into episode number 2 of this brand new podcast. Last week, we discussed some of the myths of bourbon. Today, we're going to kick off a 2-part series where we talk about some of the big moments in bourbon history. On this episode, we're going to start in 1785 and make our way up to the end of the 19th century. Before we do so, if you'd like to find out more information about Unburden with Bourbon, check out our Facebook page, and while you're there, give us a like. If you'd like to get in touch with me personally, find me on Twitter @SimonProvan and send me a DM. Now, let's get started on our journey in big moments of bourbon history on Unburden with Bourbon. I think most of you know that Unburden with Bourbon is definitely a passion project of mine, which means it doesn't pay anything. Maybe someday it will, but right now it doesn't. What I do as a career is act, do voiceover work, but also I am a professor of theater at Wisconsin Lutheran College. So what am I getting at? Well, I do have students that have to turn in papers, and with that, I make sure that they are citing their sources. So, before we launch into the actual journey of big moments in bourbon history, let me cite my sources for you that I used for today's podcast. BourbonPlus.com, TheSpiritBusiness.com, GenealogyTrails.com, and the Bourbon County, Kentucky Genealogical Society website. Okay, enough teasing. Let's actually begin our journey in big moments in bourbon history. We're going to 1785 when Bourbon County was actually established. It was originally part of Virginia, of Fayette County, but then a portion of that was broken off and named Bourbon County. I mentioned last week that Thomas Jefferson is actually responsible for naming this county Bourbon County, as it was his way of showing gratitude to France for helping out during the American Revolutionary War. So why bourbon, though? That's one thing I didn't explain. Well, Louis XVI, who was king of France at the time, could trace his lineage back to the Royal House of Bourbon. So that's how Bourbon County got its name. Now, when Kentucky became a state in 1792, Bourbon County then officially became a part of Kentucky. What's interesting to note is every once in a while on a label, you may see the term Old Bourbon. Now, this is not actually referring to the age of the bourbon. Bourbon County, when it was founded and became a part of Kentucky, was massive. In fact, it originally comprised 34 of Kentucky's 120 current counties. So there was a point in which Bourbon County itself, after it became part of Kentucky, was split up into 34 smaller counties. So when you see Old Bourbon on a bottle, it doesn't mean the bourbon is old. It means that the bourbon was distilled in the area that was once part of the original Bourbon County. One last fun fact in this first moment in bourbon history is the county seat of Bourbon County is Paris, Kentucky. Thomas Jefferson just could not get enough of making nods to France and their help during the American Revolutionary War. Now, we're not really sure if bourbon was first distilled in Bourbon County, but that's the legend, and we're going to stick with it. Now, just in case you missed it, we did start in 1785, but we actually made our way up to 1792 with the founding of Kentucky as a state. So let's fast forward another 2 years to discuss the second point in big moments in bourbon history. We are now in 1794, and we are talking about the Whiskey Rebellion. So let's actually backtrack a little bit and talk about what happened starting in 1791. So this new country, the United States of America, started to place an excise tax on any distilled spirits to help pay back the debts incurred during the Revolutionary War. Now, it was called the whiskey tax because that was the prevalent spirit in the U.S. at that time. As you can imagine, there were not many people who were very happy about this tax, and in fact, farmers in the western frontier region started to embark on a number of protests. These protests went on for the next 3 years when, in 1794, tensions were extremely high. In fact, 500 angry distillers attacked the Western Pennsylvania House of Tax Inspector General John Neville. Well, in response, President Washington, who was in his first year of his second term, sent 1,300 troops to suppress the insurgents and enforce collection of the tax. Well, most of the rebels had left before the army could get there, so really, there wasn't much of a conflict that ended up happening after that. And perhaps it's even unfair to call these people who didn't want to pay the tax rebels, because most of them fought for the colonies in the American Revolutionary War. And the reason they were so against this distilled spirits excise tax is the fact that they felt it was taxation without representation, which is exactly what they were fighting against in the American Revolutionary War. Well, as time goes on, the government continues to struggle to even collect the tax. This goes on for several years until into your picture comes a very familiar name, Thomas Jefferson. He's elected president, and by 1802, he leads the charge to have Congress repeal the whiskey tax, and that's exactly what happens. Now, to get to our third big moment in bourbon history, we only have to fast forward a year later to 1803. This is a bit of an indirect moment in history for bourbon, but still a very important moment for the bourbon industry. We are talking about the Louisiana Purchase. So we stay with President Thomas Jefferson. He sends James Monroe and Robert Livingston to France to negotiate this big land deal. And of course, Napoleon needs to raise money because he finds himself in a fight with the United Kingdom once again. And because of this fight, Napoleon is looking for quick money, which means the U.S. is able to get this land purchase for quite a good deal. In fact, it was 827,000 square miles of land west of the Mississippi for only $15 million. Now, what I just said there is key for the bourbon industry. Distillers could now make their way up and down the Mississippi River, giving them access to a lot more people than they had so before. On top of that, New Orleans was a major port, and distillers could now trade freely in that major port, making New Orleans a major hub for Kentucky bourbon. So we now leave behind Thomas Jefferson as we get to our fourth big moment in bourbon history. The year is 1823, and Scottish chemist and physician Dr. James C. Crowe moved from Scotland to Kentucky, where he applied his scientific methods to distillation. Now, he would do many things differently and basically revolutionized the way bourbon was made, and I could do an entire episode on that alone, but perhaps most importantly is that he invented the sour mash process. Records show that he invented, or at least perfected, the sour mash process in 1834, which would be the first year that we would see the first modern bourbon distilled. In fact, if you ever find yourself enjoying a bottle of Old Crow Kentucky Straight Bourbon Whiskey, that is who it's named after. Now, that brand itself has a history of its own that I won't get into, but it is thanks to James C. Crowe that we have the sour mash process, and quite frankly, the reason we can enjoy bourbon the way we do. For our fifth big moment in bourbon history, we're going to jump to the year of 1897. And to be clear, this didn't just affect the bourbon industry, this affected the spirit industry as a whole. And we can almost look at this as Kentucky distillers versus Chicago wholesalers. So we have to understand first that bourbon, and of other spirits, but we're going to focus on bourbon, was being bought by the wholesalers in barrels, not in bottles. And because it was in barrels, it was very easy to tweak and even taint that bourbon that was in there. So what was going on is these wholesalers would add all these different additives, artificial flavors to basically stretch the supply of whiskey that was in that barrel. Now, some of these things were safe. Caramel coloring, wood chips, that would help darken that whiskey color. But there was also some dangerous stuff being added in here. Formaldehyde, glycerin, all kinds of things that should not be consumed by human beings. So what was going on then is the Kentucky distillers were getting very upset when they found out this was going on. And in fact, there were a number of doctors who were also obviously very concerned about what was being consumed from these barrels. Now, you might be asking yourself, well, why were doctors concerned about this? Well, whiskey was actually also being prescribed as a medicine, and these doctors obviously wanted to trust that what they were giving their patients was the spirit that was being prescribed. And of course, distillers wanted to protect their own interest in the quality of their product. As such, the Kentucky distillers really pressed Congress to pass some type of law, and of course the wholesalers, the blenders, were not happy about this at all. But eventually, in 1897, Congress and President Grover Cleveland signed the Bottled in Bond Act, and that is still on the books today, so you may actually see bourbon being sold with the label Bottled in Bond. So what does that actually mean? Well, it guarantees customers that the bottled in bond spirit is at least 4 years old, 100 proof, and distilled at one distillery in one distilling season, with notations on the labels that indicate when it was distilled and bottled. So the law has been amended a little bit over the years, but really Bottled in Bond is still largely the same as it was in 1897. And what it does is it guarantees the consumer, it guarantees the doctor, well, at that time, that the product that is in the bottle is the product that it's promised to be. Now, Bottled in Bond is actually still sold today, but it lost its reverence back in the 70s and 80s when people really wanted lesser proof bourbon, lesser proof spirits to make for cocktails. But in recent times, Heaven Hill, Barton, and even Jim Beam have reintroduced some Bottled in Bond bourbons, and they're selling quite well. And do we really need Bottled in Bond still? Obviously, the answer is no. But as is perfectly stated over at bourbonbanter.com, it allows us to pay homage to our alcohol-making ancestors and the hard work they did to stand for what they believed in. So whether you kick back with a glass of E.H. Taylor, Old Forester 1897, or even Heaven Hill B.I.B., raise your glass to the Crusaders who made possible the legislation that led to the bourbon we know and love today. And with that, we come to the end of Episode 2 of Unburden with Bourbon. We'll have the second part of this two-part series on big moments in bourbon history on our next episode, where I'll be covering 1920 through current times. Until then, remember, don't be a burden on others by drinking and driving. After all, by doing so, you may become more than just a burden. Instead, find a place where you can enjoy this wonderful spirit, a place where you can safely unburden with bourbon.